And one of the real problems has been the people around John Howard. His finance minister is an avowed sceptic, and even last year was still defending mining industry executives denying the science. The same mining industry executives, by the way, were on committees doling out money from the government's flagship greenhouse program as well. His industry minister, who we heard of earlier, is another sceptic. When Al Gore visited Australia in 2006, Ian McFarlane said Gore was only here to sell movie tickets. He dismissed his documentary as being incorrect and said it was nothing more than entertainment. His forestry minister, Erica Betts, has said that weeds is a far more serious problem for Australia than climate change, if climate change is a problem. The foreign minister, who has said he accepts the science on climate change, nonetheless hired as his own personal speechwriter Christopher Pearse, a conservative columnist who to this day denies that humans have anything to do with climate change. His vocational education minister, who you'll be familiar with down here, also reckons the science is unproven, the warming we're seeing is mostly natural, and he dismisses climate change as a trendy cause for lefties with nothing to do after the collapse of communism. And then there's the tourism minister, another Victorian, who famously said, I think it was last year, that the solution to saving the Barrier Reef from climate change might be putting shade cloth over it. A proposal that I roughly costed after a trip to the local Bunnings at $7.4 trillion. Anyway, she recently said that wind power is a fraud and it belongs in the Northern Hemisphere. Then there's the Special Minister of State, who also says that it's all due to natural causes. If I lived across the street, I'd be in his seat, but unfortunately I won't have the pleasure of voting against them. Then there's the chair of the Howard Government Environment Policy Committee that I mentioned earlier. He actually, this is another Victorian, Russell Broadbent, he actually launched a document at Parliament House last year saying that climate change is a scam, and even suggesting that those in charge of the IPCC should be jailed, presumably along with the Nobel Peace Prize that they now share with our poor. The list goes on, but you get the idea. Many of Howard's closest colleagues don't even believe climate change is real, let alone something that humans have something to do with. So needless to say, his greenhouse policies have gone totally unchallenged. In fact, I've got friends who are MPs, and they told me that as recently as the end of last year, climate change had not been raised in the Liberal Party over the whole period of the Howard government. So, oops, jumped ahead there. The question in recent times for John Howard has become, what do you do about climate change now that the public is animated over it? What plan is he now hatching to keep avoiding emission cuts in Australia without the public noticing? Well, let me give you a few main elements. First, he's trying to appear to embrace the idea of emission reduction targets when he's actually not. Instead, what he's doing is backing three other types of targets that are distant cousins at best. First, emission increase targets, like the Kyoto target that Australia already has, which is a non-binding target after all because we haven't ratified it. Second, there are regional or global reduction targets that are also non-binding or aspirational. And third, targets that will be met anyway, such as the business as usual improvements in energy intensity and forest cover, which were recently dressed up as brand new targets at the APEC Sydney Declaration. Next, Howard's deliberately shifting the focus onto individuals through the Climate Clever campaign, miraculously timed to coincide with the election. I think the Climate Clever campaign is probably better titled Climate Conned, because the more people can be coaxed into obsessing exclusively about their own emissions, the less likely they are to realise that Australia's emissions would still rise 60% even if we cut residential emissions to zero tomorrow. 60% by mid-century, that is. And they'd be less likely to realise that even if 1 million of us took our cars off the road tomorrow, the addition of just one new aluminium smelter puts us back where we started. Third, Howard's giving the appearance of embracing renewable energy without actually requiring much renewable energy. New renewable energy. Instead, what he's doing is merely bundling up state government clean energy mandates, which he opposed, by the way, adding in the existing renewable energy capacity, including his own renewable energy mandate, which he refused to extend, and then dropping the bar such that clean coal and nuclear power qualify as clean, and then saying Australia can now have 15% of its energy from renewables, from clean sources, and that this is a trebling of the mandatory renewable energy target. In fact, it's nothing of the sort. In fact, it's business as usual. It's a repackaging of business as usual. Fourth, he's giving the appearance of embracing emissions trading, something, as we've heard, he opposed twice in Cabinet. But what he's not saying is anything about the strength of the scheme he's got in mind. So 4 years before the scheme even starts, he's happy to announce his emissions trading scheme will be the best in the world, but he won't provide any of the crucial details which will determine whether or not the scheme actually results in deep cuts in Australia's emissions. He'll say now that if his government wins another 2 elections, long after his retirement, presumably, pensioners will be compensated for the impact of carbon pricing on energy bills, but he's hiding the reason why the pensioners will be needing the compensation, and that is that he's allowed our worst polluting industries to carve themselves out of the scheme, as I mentioned earlier, which according to ABARE roughly doubles the carbon price that the rest of us pay. Finally, he's going to be throwing lots more election campaign money at climate change in the next few weeks, but put it all together and what you have after 11 years of inaction is an audacious plan to dress up more business as usual as leading the world. So what about Kevin Rudd and the Labor Party? Are they going to be any better?
No.
Well, I've ultimately concluded that the devil I don't know simply can't be worse than the devil I know. Labor has committed to some of the key steps that Australia has to take to have an effective response to climate change, but by no means all. They've committed to a long-term emissions reduction target of 60% by 2050, immediate ratification of the Kyoto Protocol, a substantial increase in the mandatory renewable energy target, and the establishment of an emissions trading scheme, and crucially, one which is actually pegged to the deep cuts in Australia's emissions by mid-century that I mentioned just a second ago. And this is really important because the Howard government has never committed to long-term emission reduction targets. So it's quite possible that we could have a Howard government emissions trading scheme that just has a perpetual series of Kyoto targets that do nothing more than simply slow growth in emissions rather than reduce them. Labor is also committed to phasing out new electric hot water systems from 2010. And importantly, they've commissioned Ross Garnaut to conduct the first full investigation of the economics of climate change for Australia. So unlike any of the work commissioned by John Howard in the past 11 years, this is finally going to cover the impacts of climate change, that adaptation challenge I referred to earlier. And it's also going to incorporate the benefits of emissions reduction, not just the costs. So there are some good signs from Labor, and I should have clicked that before. But there are also some areas of concern. The lack of detail about the strength of the emissions trading scheme and the loopholes it may allow big polluters, I should say. The lack of a medium-term emissions target. The lack of detail about how much they want to increase the mandatory renewables target. And there's also no really serious attention yet to, adaptation. As well, the ALP has its own sceptics, and some of its state governments have shown themselves vulnerable to the same sort of carbon capture to which John Howard's shown himself so susceptible. With all that in mind, I'm cautiously optimistic about Rudd government when it comes to climate change, but I've got to say I'll be more optimistic if the Greens have the balance of power in the Senate to keep them on track with climate change. Whatever happens, this issue won't be fixed on election day, no matter who wins.